All right, so this is going to start the second lecture for this week, which is going to be based off of the Baldwin and McDowell articles that we have read. So I want to get right into the Baldwin piece. So Baldwin casts into doubt some important assumptions made by many about possibilities in the US that are derived from a belief in capitalism working to allow class migration. So Baldwin's central thesis is that all of these assumptions that are made about capitalism and actually allowing fluidity between the classes, people moving from lower class to middle class, even to the upper classes, as possible because of capitalism, and he casts into doubt all of those assumptions. So the first myth that Baldwin counteracts is that poverty affects everyone similarly. Baldwin writes, quote, "All other slum dwellers, when the bank account permits it, can move out of the slum and vanish altogether from the eye of persecution. No Negro in this country has ever made that much money, and it will be a long time before any Negro does." Baldwin is arguing that even when a black person makes enough money to get out of the slum, other persecution will still be in his life. This is particularly evidenced through the reality of black families who are wealthy continuing to live in poor neighborhoods because of displays of unwelcomeness in wealthier, mostly white neighborhoods. I have linked a news article on this in today's assignment folder. Another example of this is the professor in Boston who was tackled down and arrested when he tried to get into his own home after locking himself out. Poverty, while it can be escaped by some in reality, is often still assumed in practice by those in powerful positions. The second myth that Baldwin counteracts is that people who are poor are lazy and just manage their money poorly. Baldwin importantly connects poverty with the impossibility of saving money. While cliché, it does take money to make money or to save it. He writes, quote, "Anyone who has ever struggled with poverty knows how extremely expensive it is to be poor. And if one is a member of a captive population, economically speaking, one's feet have simply been placed on the treadmill forever. One is victimized economically in 1,000 ways." If any of you have been or are currently poor, you know that it takes money to make investments in quality items, but that you often just don't have it to make the best choice, so you make the one that will get you through that moment. A good example of this is shoes. While we all know that if you spend more on a good pair of shoes, they will last you a long time, you just sometimes don't have that initial $50 or even $100 to buy those really good shoes at that moment. So you sometimes just have to spend the $15 that you have now on a not very good pair of shoes, knowing that you'll buy 5 or 6 more pairs over the next couple of years. Yeah, it's more money in the long run, but it's all you can afford now. This reality spills into other parts of being poor, like how much time it takes to apply and get government aid. Applying for food stamps takes at least a couple of hours of an online application, plus a few hours of getting fingerprinted during regular work hours when you could be or are usually working for the job that doesn't pay you enough to buy the food that you're getting food stamps for. And then you have to spend another couple more hours doing an on-site interview at the Department of Economic Services, also during working hours. This is expensive. You ironically have to take time off from a job that isn't paying you enough to pay for food so that you can actually make ends meet through government assistance. It is really expensive to be poor. The third myth that Baldwin counteracts is the myth of class mobility as being real and common. Baldwin discusses tokenism, or using the experiences of one person to eliminate the reality of lots of people. He specifically writes about the public existence of Frank Sinatra or Sammy Davis Jr., which, quote, "proves to some that America is still the land of opportunity and the inequalities vanish before the determined will. It proves nothing of the sort. The inequalities suffered by the many are in no way justified by the rise of a few. A few have always risen, in every country, every era, and in the teeth of regimes which can by no stretch of the imagination be thought of as free. Effort, hard work, and determination do not, in practice, equate with more income or class movement. This has been proven by studies done like those used to supply the data for the website you all visited and did the exercises on, inequality.is, for Monday's class. Now I want to bring up connecting Baldwin to McDowell's work. And this is going to be in a little bit of a different way than all of you are going to be doing in your 2 to 3 paragraph responses that are due this week. So McDowell emphasizes a couple of the points that Baldwin brings up in his own piece. The first is that race and class intersect with one another to form a particular kind of experience for a person inhabiting different identities in each. For example, someone who is rich and white has a different experience than someone who is rich and Asian American, or rich and black, or rich and native. This goes the same for someone who is middle class and someone who is poor. In Arizona, McDowell discusses this in terms of why and how Mobile became a settlement in the west part of the Phoenix Valley. It largely started because the land was affordable for even poor people, and it was the only place where African Americans could own land. Other parts of Phoenix were limited to white ownership, which constrained the choices of the poor African American person who wanted to own land in the early to mid-1900s. Poor white individuals had more options of where to situate their land and establish their roots. Thus, these identities of race and class intersected to create different experiences for folks who inhabited the same class status. The second point that McDowell emphasizes that Baldwin brought up in his work is that poverty decreases political power. So in Baldwin's work, he discusses this in terms of the projects that were built in Harlem. And for McDowell, she discusses it in terms of the lack of ability for the Mobile residents to stop the waste site from being established in their town. So even though the residents of Mobile actively and persistently tried to stop the hazardous waste site from being built in their community and tried multiple ways to stop it from coming to them, when they protested the facility at a public hearing process, they were met with the sheriff's department counteracting that with violence and stun guns, even though it was unprovoked. Overall, the public interest goals in establishing that waste site were disproportionately placed on this poor community in Mobile because of their lack of ability to contribute to politicians and influence politics generally. Thus, in 2002, when the Maricopa County Board of Supervisors determined another landfill was a necessity, they used the buzzwords of, quote, keeping costs down and, quote, increasing competition, which both appeal to the economic boost that would come from this waste site to target the poor Mobile community. It's important when we think about these different communities to realize that the buzzwords that we hear in the media are not often equated to the reality of the poor person in the United States. We hear a lot of people who are concerned about taking away certain things, sometimes even referred to as rights, from the wealthy. They're concerned with the wealthy not being able to accumulate more wealth. They're concerned with the wealthy being inequitably taxed. They're concerned with not being able to own property or land. But all these things are already happening to the poor person in the United States. And we need to think about how we feel living in a society that blames the poor individual rather than the system in which they live. So for this week's exercises, you need to do the response to this lecture, and you also need to write the 2 to 3 paragraph response showing the similarities between the community that Baldwin describes and the community that McDowell describes in her article. You're also welcome to draw similar conclusions from the way that Baldwin discusses the intersection of race and poverty in his piece, and how McDowell discusses the intersection of race and poverty in her piece, to some of the discussions that are currently happening in today's world, especially with the election coming up. I know that this is something that we have heard a lot of talk about, and Baldwin specifically references some of the more hot-button issues that are at place in this election. So you're more than welcome to draw conclusions between all of those things. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Otherwise, make sure that you get that done before 1:30 on Wednesday, October 5th, and submit it through the Blackboard site.